So, how does a random British guy become a Cleveland Browns fan? Hey guys, welcome back to my channel, or if you are new here, then please do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. So the question I get asked more than any other, why are you, as a British person, a Cleveland Browns fan, why would you choose to put that upon yourself? People ask, even if you made that decision in the first place, why would you then even stay and remain with that decision and carry on being a Browns fan? Well, I thought for my 100th video on my channel, I'm going to try my best to answer those questions. For a lot of UK fans, when they get into the NFL, there's loads of different reasons and loads of different ways that people choose their team. Whether it's just whatever team plays in their favorite color, whatever team's their favorite city, etc., etc. For me, it's fairly simple to explain why I initially chose the Browns, but the kind of process which led to me being the Browns fan that I am today, I suppose, is a little bit more complex. So I'm going to try and do my best to explain the full story of everything that led to me being the, very passionate Browns fan that I am today. So, as I said, the kind of basic roots of why I am a Cleveland sports fan in general is fairly simple. My family friends moved to Ohio. We went and visited them in 2005. That was the first place in America that I ever visited, and it would be less embarrassing for me to sit here and just say, yep, that's the reason why I'm a Cleveland sports fan. I visited Ohio. I saw the Browns or the Cavs or whatever, and was hooked, and that's why I'm a fan. But what actually happened, in all honesty, was that I was a very impressionable 7-year-old who just happened to fall in love with LeBron James after seeing his name and image just everywhere during that visit back in 2005. And as a British guy, a British kid whose only introduction to basketball was Space Jam and the occasional PE lesson at school, my whole world was turned upside down seeing LeBron James play basketball. As a kid who at that time looked up to Cristiano Ronaldo and Brad Pitt's portrayal of Achilles in the movie Troy, you can probably understand why I was drawn to someone like LeBron at that age. So I became a LeBron fan, as I said. I'd watch the highlights on the internet and tell everyone that I was a LeBron fan whenever it came up. And, naturally, seeing as he, of course, played for the Cleveland Cavaliers at this time, who were, the team that played in the state that I visited, I would also tell people that I was a Cavs fan whenever the kind of broader subject of the NBA came up, when I couldn't just sit there and just glaze LeBron all the time, and it was actually team specific. I would say I'm a Cavs fan. I didn't really know much about the team other than LeBron, but yeah, I'd still sit there I'm a Cavs fan and all of that. And then the first time, I think I can pinpoint the Browns truly coming up in kind of my memory. I was probably like 9 or 10, and the NFL kind of came up in a conversation. My friends would take turns bringing up teams like the Patriots, Giants, etc. And then when it would come to me, and I asked if there was a team in Cleveland. I think we searched it up, discovered that there was the Browns. So as a kid that loved LeBron James and told everyone I was a Cavs fan, I said to my friends, I'm a Cleveland Browns fan then. that continued in any future mentions of the NFL amongst my friends and people I met. People would ask if I knew about the NFL. I'd say yes. They'd ask if I had a team. I'd say the Cleveland Browns. They'd say, who the fuck are they? And I'd have absolutely nothing to tell them other than, Joe Thomas, Josh Cribbs, and I don't know, Peyton Hillis. During that period, obviously LeBron left Cleveland to join Miami. And still, to this day, I must say I am incredibly proud of myself for not jumping on the Heat bandwagon, because who knows, my entire sports fandom, American sports fandom, might be completely different today if I did do that. Instead it was the first time that my LeBron fandom separated, shall we say, from my kind of Cleveland fandom. And I actually decided that, I was a Cleveland Cavaliers fan as well as a LeBron James fan. Of course, don't get me wrong, I still followed and supported LeBron arguably as much as the Cavs, probably more if I'm being honest. But I actually did, start to Google stuff about the Cavs, learn about the team. I'd search up their position in the standings and, throughout the season, etc. And, of course, see them near the bottom every time. But still, they, of course, then drafted Kyrie Irving in 2011. And, I started to properly watch NBA and specifically Cavs highlights, religiously on YouTube and probably, following them more closely. And then, this kind of coincided with the rise, I think, in, sports highlight culture on social media as a whole, kind of around the same time, which I, of course, being the age that I am, I credit that massively for not only developing my Cavs fandom, but, also properly introducing me to the NFL and the Browns and developing those fandoms as well. Funnily enough, the same year, I mentioned Kyrie Irving. I was watching rookie Kyrie Irving highlights. I was also watching rookie Cam Newton highlights. Cam Newton for sure played a massive role in, not only my interest in the NFL, but in the entire, NFL highlight culture on social media as a whole, as it was growing at that time. You could throw in Johnny Manziel at Texas A&M as well. The first college player that I was ever watching highlights of, and, the whole world of sports highlight culture had, changed at this point and was more accessible for everyone around the world. And, those kind of guys helped, they were the guys making the most highlights, shall we say. And, of course, there's plenty of other guys as well. But, that period of kind of, as I said, highlight culture on social media becoming a true entity and being what it is today, that was forming. And, you just had way more access to not only the NBA, but now the NFL, something that was, we had some access to the NBA, and that's how I was able to, somewhat keep the Cavs fandom, ignited during those things, during those years, as well as kind of just Googling them and stuff. Whereas the NFL, you just didn't really have that much access at the time. So when, especially for a kid with no money, so when the kind of highlight culture took a hold and really kind of boomed during that era, that's kind of when my interest in the NFL and the Browns grew. So as I said, my interest in the NFL grew. I kind of thought back to the kid in me saying, I was a Browns fan whenever asked. And, similarly, as I did with the Cavs, a few years prior, started to Google the team, learn about the Browns and their history, etc. I was still a YouTube and Google fan for a few years, shall we say. I'd watch the occasional game on an illegal stream, but was much more invested, in the Cavs, especially with LeBron, of course, coming back in 2014. Although the Browns drafting Johnny Manziel that year was the first I probably like paid attention to, any kind of Browns draft and was hyped about a player they drafted, etc. But it was, LeBron returning to the Cavs did just mean a little bit more at that time for me. I watched those 4 consecutive finals runs, watched the Cavs come back from 3-1 down against the 73-9 Warriors. That at that point, my LeBron fandom reached new heights, shall we say. I'd bought all the jerseys. I actually owned a collection of Cavs jerseys and LeBron jerseys now. And, I was arguing with people online about why he's the GOAT and all of that stuff. And, I was 100% a bronzexual, or whatever they call it. And I don't even care to admit it. He had solidified himself at this point as, one of my favourite sports players of all times. One of my, just favourite celebrities, shall we say, of all time. Person of interest of all time. But enough about LeBron and the Cavs, as this is a Browns channel. But it cannot be understated the impact that he had, on my Cleveland fandom as a whole. But as I said earlier, going on a bit of a tangent, but, as I said earlier, I was still a much bigger Cavs fan than the Browns fan during this period. I watched the Johnny Manziel disaster and the 1-15 season in 2016 unfold, mainly through social media and Google, as I mentioned. But then 2017 was the first season that I had NFL Game Pass. I'd actually, going into that season was like, right, I'm going to invest into the NFL and probably, watch it as a sport. That was my first year at university. So, I actually had some money, not much, but some, but more importantly, the time to watch most of the games, which, and of course, wasn't the greatest first full season to be introduced to the Cleveland Browns, as they, of course, went 0-16. I nearly said 0-17 then, obviously the Jays now. 0-16, second team ever to go 0-16 after the Lions a few years before. I tell this story to people and they're just shocked that I'm still a Browns fan, because they just think, wow, the first full season watching the team and they go 0-16, that would probably be enough to put many people off. But Myles Garrett kept it going through that year. Rookie Myles Garrett, the hype like that. I think that was all I was clinging on to. And I will never forget going out after the Packers overtime loss that year, and just getting so drunk. And I was there telling girls, how I couldn't believe the Browns were so close to, finally winning a game, and gave up, 14 unanswered points in the fourth quarter before losing in overtime. At that moment, I didn't think it could get any worse. I was like, well, this is as bad as it gets, and it's only up from here. But of course, boy, was I wrong. The Browns didn't go 0-16 again, but I was fully introduced to the lore, shall we say, of Cleveland sports. The off season then before the 2018 season was, the first off season I fully invested in. I was, consuming all of the media. I was watching all of the talk shows. I was watching all of the Browns YouTube stuff, and watching all the breakdowns of the different quarterback prospects the Browns could take. And it's funny because, I've mentioned this before, Lamar Jackson was actually my favourite quarterback prospect in what was, the first year I'd even paid attention and put any thought into, the draft. And I joked that it was, probably because I knew fuck all that led me to that decision, as, I just saw highlights of him making guys look silly and was like, well, obviously he's the best guy. Yet despite that, it was probably one of my best draft takes that I've had, despite having, no idea what I was talking about. It just, I suppose that just shows how much of a crapshoot the draft is. But of course, they took Baker. I sold myself on him after watching all of his college highlights and, looking at his stats. And, as I said, I'd had a brief introduction to the Browns lore, but I wasn't quite as knowledgeable and understanding of the Browns quarterback hell, shall we say, that they'd been into. People were probably a bit more hesitant to buy into whatever quarterback they would have drafted that year. But for me, this is my first few years as a fully committed, watching every game Browns fan, and I'm there like, yeah, this guy's going to be the guy. And that I was really hyped and was proper, going into that season. And, as I said, the 2017 season, I didn't go into like, oh, we're going to be, we're really good. I just went into like, right, it's time to watch some Browns games. Whereas this season, I truly went into, with that hype, even though they were, went 0-16 the year before. Obviously, the Thursday night game against the Jets in week 3, that's the moment that I pinpoint, as when the Browns overtook, shall we say, the Cavs in my kind of Cleveland sports fandom tier list of interest. Just seeing Baker coming in for the comeback win, the beer fridges being opened, the celebrations from the fans for just simply winning, a game for the first time in, 19 games. It was just such a sick moment to experience. It was the first Browns game that I'd watched start to finish that they'd won. Of course, as I mentioned, the year before they went 0-16, didn't get to see any wins that year. Tied the first game of 2018, lost the second game. So this was the first game that I'd ever watched probably and saw them win. And, it was just such a sick moment to experience whilst watching it, in my uni room, on Twitter, on social media, interacting with Browns fans. And, I watched every single game the rest of that year and have watched every single Browns game, no matter what time, no matter what date, since that period. Baker breaking the rookie touchdown record, the hype entering the off season, which was then furthered with the Odell Beckham trade, and I fully became the diehard Browns fan that I am today around this point. Of course, I would be lying if I didn't admit that LeBron leaving the Cavs in 2018 again, or 2019, also played a role in my switch to the Browns as the kind of, as I said, dominant Cleveland sports team in that kind of tier list. But all of these things did play a factor in becoming as I said, the diehard Browns fan that I am today around that point. So to summarise, the reason that I'm a Cleveland sports fan, is because the first place that I visited in the United States was Ohio, where I saw LeBron James's name and an image everywhere, which, led to a 7-year-old me eventually becoming a lifelong Cleveland sports fan. My fandom initially started as just an online interest in LeBron and the Cavs, which eventually, led to a much bigger interest in the Cavs, whilst, my online interest in the Browns and the NFL started to begin. And, I was a fully committed Cavs fan for the 4 finals appearances and, over all those years. And during that point is when my interest, in the Browns grew to a point where, as I mentioned, they overtook the Cavs in 2018. And, since then, I became the nerd that I am today. I got into the analytics of football, learned about the sport and the history of, not just the Browns, but many teams, probably all the teams, and, essentially built an interest that, led me to having so much to say about the Browns and the NFL that I started doing podcasts and, set up this YouTube channel. And, finally, to sum up my Browns fandom, as I said at the start, I don't only get asked, why I'm a Browns fan. People then also ask, why the hell I would stick with a team that has had the worst record in the NFL since I was born. Throughout the years of my fandom, people I meet would always ask us, why don't you just pick another team? You have no kind of real tie to that place. It's not like you were born there, so why don't you just pick another team? And I suppose the answer to that is because I'm a pretty loyal person, especially when it comes to my sports teams. And I've always had an underdog mentality, shall we say, when it comes to sports because of the teams that I follow. I've mentioned it before, but when it comes to British sports, I am a Swansea City fan and a Welsh football and rugby fan. The teams I was essentially born to follow have never been top teams. They're not the top teams in their respective sports, but instead teams that, the success that they achieved was through overachieving. Swansea went from being sold for £1. That's right, £1, £1 British, which is even less in dollars, in 2001, to beating Hull in the last game of the season in 2003, to avoid being relegated. Which, if any Americans listening, that means you go down a league. But not just relegated down a league, but relegated out of the English football pyramids altogether, which would have likely resulted in liquidation due to bankruptcy. The team probably would have no longer, it would have ceased to exist, and I'd have lost my football club. That to then being promoted to the Premier League in 2011. So, as I said, from being sold for £1 and, the near death of my club, to 3 promotions and the Premier League all within 10 years. They stayed in the Premier League for 7 years. They won a major trophy and even played in Europe. Just massive achievements for a small club. Wales rugby have been successful domestically, of course, in the Six Nations, etc. But, they've never won a World Cup. And the greatest achievement in Welsh football was making the semi-finals of the European Championship in 2016. And, that might sound like I'm making a joke, but, that was genuinely the greatest moment in my sporting life. That's the point I'm trying to make with the underdog mentality. And, the point I'm trying to make is that, I was essentially born into being the underdog when it comes to my sports teams. So, after the foundations were set for my Cleveland Browns fandom, I was never going to just abandon ship, no matter how little I even knew about the team early on, and regardless of how many games they lost and how many people told me how shit they were and how you should pick another team. And, that translated into my approach to, my Browns fandom today. Some people say that I'm too optimistic. But I just don't see the point in approaching sports fandom in a negative way. Maybe it's because, as I mentioned, my traditional British sports teams, they're not big clubs, and I had to accept that they'll never be big clubs. I accepted that a long time ago. So when it comes to the Browns playing in a league where everyone has the same salary cap and nobody can be relegated, of course I'm going to believe that they have a fucking chance. I think that's just the way I see it. And, I'll always approach my sports fandoms with an optimistic, but, still honest approach. I'll recognise when things are bad, of course, but, I'm always going to cling on to that underdog mentality, and that belief that, one day it will be our year. Because, as I said, I went through some rough times growing up with Swansea, and then, to see them actually make it to the Premier League and achieve the things that they did, to see my team, my parents never watched Wales football play in an international tournament until 2016. It wasn't just me that had never watched them up until that point. My parents had never watched them in their lifetimes. That's how long it had been. 1958 was the last time they'd made an international tournament, before 2016. So to then make that tournament, that alone was amazing and was something worth celebrating as Welsh fans. And but to then make the semi-final was just, we didn't win it, but that achievement, and as an underdog, as I said, to make it that far when you thought you never had a chance to even get near there. That's just kind of why I have the optimistic approach I do with my American sports teams as well. Because as I said, the hurdles that were in the way for for Wales and for Swansea, they're not in the way for the Browns. So I'm never ever going to accept that they'll never have a chance, because they will always have a chance as long as the NFL and the current structure exists. But that's the best way that I can explain, how I became the Browns fan that I am today. From a 7-year-old kid discovering LeBron James while visiting Ohio, to arguably, Britain's biggest Browns fan 20 years later. I'm still a massive Cavs fan as well. You probably noticed with the hat. I watch as many games as I can nowadays, but it is hard following the NBA in the UK when you have a full-time job. It was much easier when I was at sixth form and university, and I could stay up to 1:30 to watch these games every night. Although, as much as I am still a massive Cavs fan, of course, I think the order of my Cleveland sports team interest will always remain the same as it is now. Browns, Cavs, and then the Guardians. But hey, I won't completely rule out a potential Cavs channel in the future, because you never know. And who knows, maybe in an alternative universe, maybe even a Guardians channel as well. But I highly doubt that. But that would do it for me today, guys. I hope I didn't ramble too much and, explain my Browns fandom in a way that you could understand. As with any topic I talk about, I encourage any comments or questions. So, if you have anything more that you want to know about my Browns fandom, about my Cleveland sports fandom, then just let me know in the comments below. But if you do enjoy my content, then please drop this video a like, hit the subscribe button. It's free, but it really, really helps out my channel. You can also check the links in the description to see where you can follow and interact with me on social media. As I always say, I'm trying to build a community of Cleveland Browns fans, and even if that means I only get to talk to one fan a day, I'm happy, because I'm talking Browns football with the best fan base in the world. Thanks again for watching, guys. Have an amazing weekend, but most importantly, go Cleveland.